No one will buy me because I'm fat. That's what the girl cried. Her voice, thin and cracking, cut through the biting February wind. It sliced through the mocking laughter of the assembled crowd, silencing them for a heartbeat. The whole town of Pine Crossing was there, their boots crunching in the dirty frozen snow. They were gathered for a livestock auction, but they'd gotten a different kind of show. Her stepfather, a worthless drunk named Boyd, had his hand clamped on her arm like a rusty bear trap. He dragged her onto the auction block, right next to a pen of scrawny cattle, as if she were just another piece of property to be sold off. And for a long, humiliating moment, no one had offered a single cent, just jeers and cruel jokes about her size. "Might need 2 horses to haul her," someone shouted. "Better reinforce that wagon bed," another voice cackled. Tears froze on her cheeks. Her name was Clara, and she thought this was the end. Shamed in front of everyone she'd ever known. Sold off like a sack of grain. But then, a figure broke from the back of the crowd. A man tall as a pine tree, wrapped in buckskin and silence. He moved with a purpose that parted the onlookers like a ship through water. He didn't offer a price. He did something much stranger. He walked right up to Boyd, looked him dead in the eye, and paid him triple the man's drunken asking price in gold coin. But you have to understand, this wasn't an act of mercy. It was the first shot fired in a war for the one thing every man in that high country would kill for: water. The girl, Clara, didn't know it yet, but she held the key. A secret her mother had left behind. A secret that could make a man a king or starve an entire valley. And with the railroad company and their hired guns already closing in, the man who just bought her would have to make a choice. Between the law of the gun and the law of the heart. The man was Eli Brannick, a name whispered in the saloons, a ghost of the high mountains. People said he could track a whisper on the wind, and that he spoke more to the beasts of the forest than to men. His face was a roadmap of hard seasons, his beard shot through with silver, but his eyes were sharp and clear as a winter sky. They were fixed on Boyd, and there was no warmth in them. Boyd, suddenly flushed with more coin than he'd seen in a year, stumbled back, his grip on Clara finally loosening. He was a small man, made smaller by the shadow Eli cast over him. The auctioneer, a nervous man named Wheeler, tried to make sense of it. "Now, this ain't exactly proper, Eli." Eli's voice was low, like rocks grinding in a riverbed, but it carried across the entire yard. "Proper is what the judge says it is. Someone fetch him." His tone left no room for argument. A kid darted off, eager to be part of the drama. The crowd buzzed, their mockery turning to fascinated whispers. Who was this girl, that the mountain man would pay a fortune for her? Clara stood frozen on the platform, her thin shawl doing nothing to stop the shivers that racked her body. She was trading one cage for another, but she had no idea what kind of animal waited in the new one. Was this a rescue, or just a different kind of monster? She couldn't tell. And the way Eli was looking at her, not with pity, but with a strange, unreadable intensity, it scared her more than the auction block. Judge Wilson arrived, his black coat flapping around his thin frame. He was a man who had seen the frontier's strange sense of justice play out in 100 different ways, but even he seemed taken aback. He looked from Boyd's greedy, triumphant face to Eli's granite stare, and finally to Clara, trembling on the block. "Mr. Brannick," the judge said, his breath fogging in the air, "you understand what you're proposing?" "Full guardianship." "I do," Eli said. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. "The girl needs a proper home." The judge pulled out a set of papers from his coat, using the auctioneer's podium as a makeshift desk. The scratch of his pen was the only sound in the yard. "Boyd," the judge said, not looking up, "you are her legal guardian? You consent to transfer these rights?" Boyd's eyes darted from the gold coins Eli had slapped on the podium to the mountain man's unblinking gaze. Clara could see the greasy wheels turning in his head. This was his ticket out. The money would clear his debts at the saloon and set him up for the rest of the winter. He didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he grunted, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "I consent." He made his sloppy mark on the paper. Eli followed with a signature that was surprisingly neat and precise. It was done. Just like that. Her life had been signed away. Get your things, Eli said to Clara. It was the first time he'd spoken directly to her. His voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It was just final. I I don't have much, she whispered, her voice still shaky. Whatever's yours by right, he replied, his gaze unwavering. I'll wait. She practically fled from the platform, her legs unsteady. The crowd parted for her, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She ran to the small, miserable house she'd shared with Boyd at the edge of town, her mind a complete blank. She grabbed the few things that were truly hers, her mother's worn Bible, two faded dresses, and a small tin box of hair ribbons her mother had given her years ago. It was a pathetic collection, the sum total of her entire life. When she returned, Eli was right where she'd left him, as still and unmovable as the mountains he came from. He hitched his chin toward a sturdy sled hitched to a powerful-looking mule. Time to go, he said. As she climbed onto the sled, clutching her small bundle, she saw Boyd already stumbling toward the saloon doors, his new wealth clinking in his pocket. He didn't look back once. Not once. The sled runners creaked as they pulled away, leaving Pine Crossing and her old life behind. The snow was starting to fall harder now, thick, wet flakes that blurred the edges of the world. She was alone with a stranger, heading into a wilderness she didn't know, toward a future she couldn't possibly imagine. And a terrifying question began to form in her mind. Why? Why would a man like Eli Brannick pay so much for a girl like her? There had to be a reason, and she was terribly afraid to find out what it was. The sled moved through a world that was turning pure white. The sounds of the town faded behind them, replaced by the soft thump of the mule's hooves in the deepening snow and the whisper of the runners. The silence in the sled was heavier than the snow-laden sky. Clara sat rigid, clutching her bundle so tightly her knuckles were white. She kept stealing glances at the man beside her. Eli Brannick. He just stared straight ahead, his hands firm on the reins, his profile like something carved from the mountainside. She replayed the scene at the auction over and over in her head, the humiliation, the laughter, and then his sudden appearance. It didn't make sense. No one in Pine Crossing had ever shown her a moment's kindness, let alone an act of such impossible charity. People on the frontier didn't just give away gold for nothing. Everyone wanted something. She had to know. The question was a physical ache in her chest. Why? She finally whispered, her voice so small she wasn't sure he heard it over the wind. He didn't turn his head. For a long moment, she thought he would ignore her. Then he spoke. Knew your mother. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her mother? Her mother had been dead for 3 years. She had faded into a collection of hazy, gentle memories. You knew her. A long time ago, Eli said, his voice still low and even. She was a good woman. Didn't deserve the hand she was dealt. Especially not Boyd. The way he said Boyd's name was like spitting out something rotten. A flicker of something hot and dangerous flashed in his eyes, there and then gone. This changed everything. This wasn't random. It was personal. But it only brought more questions. Did she ever speak of me? She did, Eli said. Said you were strong. Stronger than you knew. He paused and for the first time turned to look at her. His eyes weren't cold now. They were filled with a deep, ancient sadness. Made her a promise. Said if she ever needed anything, I'd be there. I was too late for her. I won't be too late for you. A promise. He had done this because of a promise to a dead woman. The idea was so pure, so unlike the transactional cruelty she was used to, that Clara couldn't quite wrap her head around it. But before she could ask more, Eli's body went tense. He pulled the mule to a sudden stop, his head cocked, listening to the wind. Clara couldn't hear anything but the snow falling. What is it? She asked. Company, he said, his hand moving slowly, deliberately, toward the long rifle resting beside him on the seat. And they ain't friendly. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She peered into the swirling snow behind them. At first she saw nothing. Then through the white curtain, she made out 2 dark shapes on horseback, moving fast, closing the distance. The railroad. It had to be. Boyd must have gone straight from the saloon to the railroad foreman, Jenkins. He'd sold her once for gold, and now he'd sold her out for a second time. The rescue was over. The nightmare was just beginning. "Hold tight," Eli said, his voice deadly calm. He snapped the reins, and the mule surged forward, pulling the sled off the main trail and into the thick, treacherous pines. The chase was on. The horses were faster, but Eli knew the woods. He drove the sled like a madman, weaving between ancient trees, the runners skidding just inches from disaster. Branches whipped at Clara's face and she ducked low, clinging to the seat for dear life. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and ugly. A splinter of bark exploded from a tree right next to her head. They were shooting at them. They were actually trying to kill them. This wasn't just about stopping them. This was about silencing them. Eli didn't flinch. He just pushed the mule harder. He wasn't running scared. He was running smart. He was leading them somewhere. The terrain grew steeper, the trees tighter. The horsemen were forced to slow down, their mounts struggling in the deep snow and dense undergrowth. Eli knew this mountain like the back of his hand. He was luring them into a trap. He rounded a massive rock outcropping and yanked the mule to a halt in its shadow. "Stay down," he hissed to Clara. He grabbed his rifle, swung himself off the sled, and disappeared into the trees as silently as a ghost. Clara was alone. Her breath came in ragged, terrified gasps. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder. She could hear the men cursing as they fought their way through the forest. They were close, so close. Then a single rifle shot echoed through the valley. It was deeper, heavier than the pistol shots from before. It was Eli's gun. One of the men screamed, a sharp, ugly sound that was cut short. There was a crash, the sound of a horse falling, then silence, a heavy, ringing silence. Clara waited, her body coiled like a spring, every nerve screaming. What had happened? Was Eli okay? Was the other man still out there waiting? Minutes stretched into an eternity. The snow fell, covering the tracks, burying the sounds. Just as she was about to risk a peek, a figure emerged from the trees. It was Eli. He moved without a sound, his rifle held loosely in one hand. There was no blood on him, but his face was grim. "They're gone," he said, his voice flat. "For now." He didn't explain what had happened, and Clara didn't ask. She didn't want to know. He climbed back onto the sled and got them moving again, pushing deeper and higher into the mountains, away from the trail, away from anything that looked like civilization. The fear that had gripped Clara began to slowly recede, replaced by a cold, hard realization. The promise Eli had made her mother. It was more than just a promise of a safe home. He was protecting her from something, something that men were willing to kill for. And whatever it was, it had just followed them into the wilderness. The war hadn't been left behind in Pine Crossing. They had just dragged it onto a new battlefield. As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of purple and gray, the world grew even quieter. The temperature plummeted. Clara huddled under the heavy buffalo robe Eli had given her. But the cold was a living thing, seeping into her bones. She had never been this deep in the mountains before. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. The jagged peaks looked like the teeth of some giant sleeping beast. It was beautiful, but it was a deadly kind of beauty. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Eli turned the sled into a narrow, almost hidden path. Through a thick stand of pines, a small cabin came into view. It wasn't much more than a box made of logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the evening air. It looked solid, safe, and impossibly welcoming. "Home," Eli said, the single word hanging in the frozen air. He helped her down from the sled, his grip firm on her arm as her stiff legs threatened to buckle. While he tended to the mule, settling the animal in a small lean-to, Clara stood and stared at the cabin. This was it, her new life. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was one room, but it was clean and surprisingly warm. A fire was already crackling in a large stone hearth, casting a dancing golden light across the space. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves packed with jars of preserves, and a cast-iron cook stove. In one corner there was a narrow bed, but what caught her eye was another corner, sectioned off by a thick curtain. "That'll be your space," Eli said, coming in behind her and stamping the snow from his boots. "Put it up last fall. Figured it might be needed." Clara walked over to the curtain and pulled it back. Behind it was another small bed, a chest at his foot, and a little shelf built into the wall. It wasn't much, but it was the first time in her life she had ever had a space that was entirely her own. A wave of emotion so strong it made her dizzy washed over her. She turned to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Eli didn't seem to notice. He was already moving with quiet efficiency, pulling a skillet from a hook and slicing salt pork into it. The smell of the meat sizzling over the fire made Clara's stomach rumble loud enough for him to hear. A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. Supper's on its way. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of forks on tin plates. Eli gave her the larger portion without a word. For the first time all day, Clara felt the knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen. Here in this small, warm cabin, with the storm raging outside and a quiet mountain man for company, she felt safe. It was a foreign feeling, but a welcome one. After they cleaned up, Eli took out a whetstone and began to sharpen a large hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was hypnotic. Clara sat by the fire, soaking in the warmth, her mind finally starting to process the day's events. The auction, the promise, the chase through the woods. "Those men," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They were from the railroad, weren't they?" Eli didn't look up from his work. "Jenkins' men. He's the foreman." "Boyd was in debt to him," she said, the pieces clicking into place. "I heard them arguing. Jenkins wants this land. He wants the water from the creek." Eli finally stopped sharpening the knife. He held it up, testing the edge with his thumb. He looked at her, his eyes serious. "He wants more than the water, Clara. The water is just the key. Your mother knew what was hidden here. It's why she bought this land in the first place, before she ever met your stepfather." Clara frowned. "Hidden? What's hidden here?" Eli set the knife down and leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Something the railroad would kill for. Something that could change this whole territory. Your mother left behind proof. Proof of ownership. It's our only weapon against them." He paused, his gaze intense. "She told me she kept it somewhere safe. A document. Do you have any idea where it might be?" Clara's mind raced. A document. Something important. Her mother had always been careful with papers. Then an image surfaced from the depths of her memory. A small tin box. A box with a picture of Christmas cookies on the lid. The box she'd packed in her bundle. The box that was sitting in the corner, not 5 feet from where she sat. "The ribbons," she breathed. "The tin box." Her heart started pounding. She scrambled over to her meager belongings, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the lid. She pulled out the faded ribbons, and underneath them, folded into a neat square, was a thick piece of paper, yellowed with age. It wasn't just a document. It was a map, and scrawled across the top, in her mother's elegant handwriting, were the words, "For Clara, our future." Eli came to her side, looking down at the map she unfolded. His face was grim. "So, you found it." "What is it?" Clara asked, her eyes tracing the strange lines and symbols. "It's the reason Jenkins wants you dead," Eli said quietly. "And it's the reason they'll never stop hunting us." He pointed to a spot on the map marked with a star. "That's the heart of the mountain, and according to this, it's full of silver." The word hung in the air between them. Silver. A fortune. Enough to build cities, to fund armies, to buy and sell men like Jenkins 100 times over. This whole time, she had been living on top of a treasure, and she never even knew it. Her mother had tried to protect it, and now it was up to her. The paper in her hands wasn't just a map. It was a death warrant, and she had just brought it directly into the crosshairs of the most powerful and ruthless company in the West. The warmth of the cabin suddenly felt like a lie. There was no safe place. Not anymore. The war for the mountain had just found its fuse, and she was the one holding the match. The revelation of the map changed the air in the cabin. The cozy refuge now felt like a fortress under siege. The howling wind outside was no longer just weather. It sounded like the whispers of Jenkins' men, circling in the dark. Eli studied the map under the lantern light, his brow furrowed in concentration. Clara watched him, the tin box resting in her lap like a cold weight. My mother, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Did she know you when she made this? We knew each other, Eli corrected gently, his eyes still on the map. Before Boyd, before she got sick. We both saw what the railroad was doing, how they were swallowing up the land, pushing people out. She bought this claim, this piece of the mountain, fair and square. She used her inheritance. She wanted a place to be free, but she found more than she bargained for. He tapped the silver deposit marked on the map. She found this, and she knew it was a curse as much as a blessing. He explained that the map wasn't just a route to the silver. It was a legal claim, registered with the territorial office years ago, before the railroad had bought up all the politicians. Her mother's name, Mary Boyd, was on it, which meant the claim now belonged to her only heir, Clara. This is why Jenkins wanted you, Eli said, finally looking up. It wasn't just about the water for his steam engines. That was the excuse. With you under his control, married off to one of his thugs or declared incompetent, he could control your inheritance. He could control the silver. He let out a long, slow breath. Boyd was too stupid to understand the real prize. He just knew the land was worth something to Jenkins, and he was desperate enough to sell you to get it. It was all so much bigger and uglier than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just a burden her stepfather wanted to be rid of. She was a pawn in a massive, deadly game for a fortune buried in the rock beneath their feet. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Eli was no longer just a quiet mountain man. He was a soldier preparing his defenses. He showed Clara how to load and fire the rifle, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm and steady as he explained the mechanism. You don't ever point it at something you don't intend to shoot, he said, his words sinking in deep. And you hope you never have to shoot. He took her outside and had her practice on pine cones, teaching her to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. To her surprise, she was a natural. The rifle felt heavy but balanced in her hands. There was a grim satisfaction in hitting her target. He also taught her about the mountain. They walked the perimeter of the cabin, and he showed her how to set snares, not just for food, but as early warning systems. He pointed out escape routes, hidden game trails that a man on horseback would never find. The mountain can be your enemy, he said, his breath pluming in the cold air, or it can be your greatest ally. You just have to know how to listen to it. One morning, as Clara was fetching water from a small ice-fringed spring near the cabin, she saw a figure approaching through the trees. Her first instinct was to run, her heart leaping into her throat. But then she saw it wasn't one of Jenkins' men. It was a woman moving on silent snowshoes, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Eli met her at the edge of the clearing. Mariah, he said, his voice holding a warmth Clara hadn't heard before. The woman was Native American, her face weathered and wise, her long black hair braided with silver threads. Her dark eyes took in Clara with a piercing intelligence. There was no surprise in them. So the ghost of the mountain has taken in a stray, the woman, Mariah said. Her voice was rich and melodic. The talk in town is that you started a war, Eli. The war was already here, Eli replied. We just chose a side. Mariah Two Feathers, as Eli introduced her, became their lifeline. She was a friend, not just to Eli, but to her people who lived downstream. The railroad's plan to dam the creek wouldn't just affect Eli's claim, it would starve her village. She brought them news from town, carried on whispers and rumors. Jenkins was hiring more men, hard cases from out of territory. He was telling everyone that Eli Brannock had kidnapped a young girl and was holding her against her will. He was painting Eli as a dangerous outlaw to justify whatever violence he had planned. Mariah also brought them knowledge. She looked at Clara's mother's map and nodded slowly. My people have known of this place, she said, pointing to the silver deposit. We call it the Singing Stone. It is a sacred place. We do not take from it. She looked at Clara, her eyes kind. Your mother understood this. She respected the mountain. The railroad men do not. They will tear its heart out and leave it to bleed. One evening, as the three of them sat around the fire, Mariah shared a chilling piece of news. Jenkins had brought in the law, a territorial marshal, a man known to be in the railroad's pocket. They had a warrant for Eli's arrest. for kidnapping. They'll use it as an excuse to storm this cabin, Eli said, his voice grim. They won't try to take me alive. They'll come in shooting and claim I resisted arrest. Clara's blood ran cold. This was her fault. If she hadn't been on that auction block, Eli wouldn't be in this danger. We have to go, she said, her voice urgent. We can run. Use the trails you showed me. Eli shook his head. Run where? They own the towns. They own the law. There's nowhere to run. We make our stand here. Mariah placed a calming hand on Clara's arm. He is right, she said. Running is what they want. It makes you look guilty, but we do not have to fight their way. She looked at the map, then at Eli. The singing stone is in a place of many caves, a maze. A man who does not know the way could be lost forever. A plan began to form. A desperate, dangerous plan. They couldn't win a straight fight. Jenkins had more men, more guns. But they had the map. They had knowledge of the mountain. And they had the coming weather on their side. A massive blizzard was rolling in from the north. A white death, as Mariah called it. A storm that could bury a man in minutes. The idea was simple. They wouldn't wait for Jenkins to come to them. They would lure him out. They would use the map, the promise of silver, as bait. They would lead him and his men into the high country, into the heart of the storm, and into the maze of caves from which there was no easy escape. It's a suicide mission, Clara whispered, looking at the treacherous terrain on the map. Staying here is suicide, Eli countered. This way, we choose the ground. We fight on our terms. The final piece of the plan fell into place when Mariah revealed one more secret. There is another way into the caves, she said, tracing a faint line on the map that Clara's mother hadn't drawn. A back door, a path my people use. We can lead them into the maze and slip out behind them. The storm will do the rest. It was their only chance, a wild, desperate gamble with their lives. As the first winds of the blizzard began to whip through the pines, they made their final preparations. Eli packed ammunition and dried rations. Mariah brewed a strong, bitter tea from herbs that she said would keep them warm and focused. And Clara, she took her mother's map and made a copy. A nearly perfect copy, but with one small, crucial change. She altered the entrance to the main cave system, shifting it to a different location on the map. A location that led not to the silver, but to a treacherous, unstable rock shelf known for avalanches. She would leave the fake map behind for Jenkins to find. It was her idea, her contribution to the fight. She was no longer a victim to be sold or a pawn to be used. She was a player in the game. As she finished the drawing, her hands steady, she looked up at Eli. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The storm was coming, and so were they. The blizzard hit them with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at their clothes and driving snow so thick they couldn't see 10 feet in front of them. It was a world of pure, violent white. Following Mariah, they abandoned the cabin, leaving behind a warm fire and a pot of stew on the stove. And on the table, laid out as if it had been carelessly forgotten, was Clara's forged map. The bait was set. They didn't have to wait long. Huddled in a shallow rock overhang a quarter-mile from the cabin, they watched as Jenkins and his posse of 6 riders emerged from the swirling snow. They were brutal-looking men, wrapped in heavy coats, rifles held at the ready. Jenkins, a big man with a cruel face and a thick, dark beard, dismounted and kicked open the cabin door. Clara held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. Would he fall for it? After a few moments, Jenkins emerged, waving the fake map in his gloved hand. A triumphant shout, snatched away by the wind, was all the confirmation they needed. He'd taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. The men mounted up and, after a brief, violent argument about which way to go, they headed off in the direction the false map indicated, straight toward the avalanche zone. Now we move, Eli said, his voice a low rumble against the storm. Their own journey was a nightmare. Mariah led them with an unerring sense of direction that seemed impossible in the whiteout conditions. She read the slope of the land, the shape of the wind-blasted trees, the feel of the rock under her feet. They climbed higher and higher into the teeth of the storm. The cold was brutal, a physical pain that gnawed at them. Clara's face was numb, and her fingers, even in their thick mittens, felt like blocks of ice. But she didn't complain. She just put her head down and followed the dark shape of Eli in front of her, planting her feet in the tracks he made. He had tied a rope around her waist, connecting her to him. It was a lifeline. If she slipped on the treacherous, ice-covered rocks, he would hold her. The simple fact of that rope, that physical connection, gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She was not alone in this. Hours bled into one another. There was no day, no night, just the screaming white of the storm. Finally, Mariah stopped. She pointed toward a fissure in a massive wall of rock, a crack so narrow it was almost invisible. "The back door!" she gasped, her face caked with ice. Inside, the roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. The air was cold but still. Eli lit a lantern, and its light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into the belly of the mountain. This was the maze of the Singing Stone. They moved through the caves for what felt like days. Mariah led them through a labyrinth of twisting passages, vast underground chambers filled with bizarre rock formations, and across terrifyingly narrow ledges that dropped off into black nothingness. Without her, they would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. She was their guide, their guardian in this dark, silent world. Finally, she brought them into a vast cavern. In the center, illuminated by their lantern, was a vein of rock that seemed to sparkle with its own internal light. It ran up the entire wall of the cavern, a river of frozen starlight. "The Singing Stone," Mariah whispered, her voice filled with reverence. It was the silver. It was real. Clara reached out and touched the wall. It was cold and smooth, and she could almost feel a faint vibration under her fingertips, a low hum that was more felt than heard. The heart of the mountain. But they couldn't linger. Eli checked his pocket watch. "They'll have realized the map is a fake by now," he said. "If the avalanche didn't get them, they'll be trying to backtrack. They might stumble onto the real entrance." The main entrance to the cave system was on the other side of the mountain, a wide, gaping mouth that was much easier to find. That's where they needed to go. They had to seal it, to trap Jenkins and his men inside the mountain forever. They found the entrance just as the first light of dawn was breaking. The blizzard had started to ease, the wind dying down to a low moan. The main cave mouth was a dark blotch against the new-fallen snow. And there were tracks, fresh tracks. "They're inside," Eli said grimly. They survived the slide, and they found their way in. The plan had been to start a rock slide, to seal the entrance from the outside. But now the hunters were inside the trap with them. The plan had to change. This would have to be settled face to face. "Mariah," Eli said, turning to her, "take Clara. Follow the ridge down the west slope. It will lead you back toward your village. Don't stop for anything." "No," Clara said, her voice firm. She was surprised by her own conviction. "I'm not leaving you." "Clara, this is not a discussion," Eli said, his tone hard. "You made a promise to my mother to protect me," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But I'm making a promise to you now. I'm not running. We finish this together." Before Eli could argue, Mariah spoke. "Her spirit is strong," she said, a look of respect in her eyes. "She stays. 2 guns are better than 1. 3 are better still." She pulled a large, sheathed knife from her belt. Eli looked from Clara's determined face to Mariah's steady gaze. He gave a short, sharp nod. "All right, together." They slipped into the cave, their lanterns extinguished. They would use the darkness as their weapon. The hunters had become the hunted. They moved silently, using their knowledge of the layout to their advantage. Soon they heard voices echoing from deeper within. Angry, frustrated voices. Jenkins and his men were lost, and they were getting desperate. Eli held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He pointed down a side passage. A plan formed in his eyes, a silent communication that Clara now understood perfectly. They would split up. They would herd their prey. Clara's heart was a frantic drum, but her hands were steady on her rifle. She remembered Eli's words. "Control your breathing. Squeeze. Don't pull." She moved down the passage he had indicated, the darkness total, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the distant, angry voices of their enemies. She was terrified, but underneath the terror was a core of cold, hard steel. Boyd had tried to break her. The town had tried to shame her. Jenkins had tried to kill her. They had all failed. She was not the fat girl on the auction block anymore. She was a survivor, and she was about to become a hunter. The final battle for the mountain had begun. The darkness of the cave was absolute. It was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. Clara flattened herself against a cold, damp rock wall, her rifle clutched tightly. She could hear them now, not just their voices, but the crunch of their boots on the gravel floor, the clink of metal against rock. They were getting closer. Her passage was going to intercept them. This was it. Following Eli's silent instructions, she waited. The plan was to create a diversion, to drive Jenkins and his men deeper into the maze, toward a chamber with only one exit where Eli and Mariah would be waiting. Her job was to be the ghost, the unseen threat that spooked the herd. The first of Jenkins' men passed the opening of her tunnel. She could smell the wet wool of his coat, hear his ragged, angry breathing. She let him pass. Then the second, then a third. She counted 4 of them, which meant Jenkins and 2 others were still somewhere behind. She waited until the last man was directly in front of her opening. She didn't aim at him. She aimed at the rock wall just above his head. She held her breath, squeezed the trigger, and the rifle roared, the sound magnified 100 times by the enclosed space. The muzzle flash was a blinding white flower in the dark. The man screamed, not in pain, but in sheer terror, as rock fragments rained down around him. He fired his own pistol wildly into the darkness, the bullets ricocheting with angry whines. "They're over here!" he shrieked. "They're in the walls!" It was exactly the reaction they wanted. Panic. The men already on edge from being lost, broke and ran. Not back the way they came, but forward, deeper into the cave, just as Eli had predicted. Clara didn't wait to see more. She turned and melted back into the side passage, her heart hammering. She had done it. She had fired the first shot. She followed a parallel tunnel, one Mariah had pointed out on the map, that would bring her to the ambush point from a different angle. She moved as quietly as she could, her senses on fire. The cave was a symphony of sounds now. The shouts of the men, the echo of their running feet, and something else. A low rhythmic booming. It was distant, but it was getting louder. She reached the designated chamber, a large cavern that looked like a cathedral sculpted by water and time. She took up a position behind a thick pillar of rock, looking down into the main area. Below she could see Eli, hidden in the shadows on one side, and Mariah concealed in a crevice on the other. They were ready. Jenkins and his 4 men stumbled into the cavern, their lanterns swinging wildly, casting frantic, dancing shadows. They were trapped. The passage they'd come through was the only way in or out. "Show yourself, Brannick!" Jenkins bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "You can't hide in here forever." "I'm not the one who's hiding, Jenkins," Eli's voice called out, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You're the one who's trapped." The men spun around, raising their guns, but there was nothing to shoot at, just shadows. "I have a warrant for your arrest," Jenkins shouted, trying to sound authoritative, but his voice was strained. "Your warrant's no good here," Eli's voice answered. "There's only one law on this mountain, and you've broken it." That's when Clara realized what the booming sound was. It was coming from outside. A deep, resonating thunder that shook the very rock she was leaning against. Another avalanche. But this one was massive. The fake map. The unstable slope. Their diversion had worked even better than they'd planned. The vibrations from her rifle shot must have been the final straw. The whole side of the mountain was coming down. The entrance to the cavern began to shudder. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Jenkins and his men looked up in horror. The only way out was about to be buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock and snow. Their panic turned into primal fear. They made a mad dash for the exit. "No!" Jenkins screamed, but it was too late. With a deafening roar, the passageway collapsed. A wall of rock and debris sealed them in. The sound was final. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. They were sealed in, all of them. The lanterns of Jenkins' men cast a sickly yellow light on the scene of their new prison. The men were screaming, clawing at the rockfall, but it was useless. They were entombed. "Now what, Brannick?" Jenkins snarled, turning from the rubble, his face a mask of fury and fear. He finally spotted Eli stepping out from the shadows, his rifle held steady. "You've killed us all." "You did this to yourself, Jenkins," Eli said, his voice cold as the grave. "You got greedy. You pushed too far." The standoff was tense. It was 5 against 3, but Jenkins' men were demoralized, their will broken. Suddenly, one of them raised his pistol and fired at Eli. Mariah, moving with the speed of a striking snake, threw the knife she held. It flew through the air, a silver streak, and buried itself in the man's shoulder. He shrieked and dropped his gun. That's when all hell broke loose. The cave erupted in gunfire, the flashes of the pistols and rifles creating a strobing, nightmarish scene. Clara found herself acting on pure instinct. She saw one of the thugs aiming at an exposed Eli. She raised her own rifle, found her target, and fired. The man crumpled to the ground. She didn't feel triumph, only a sick, hollow feeling. But she was alive, and so was Eli. 2 more of Jenkins' men went down, one to Eli's rifle, the other falling back with a surprised look on his face, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Now it was just Jenkins. He stood alone, his pistol empty, his face pale in the lantern light. He looked from Eli to Clara, and a strange, twisted smile spread across his face. "So, the little fat girl found some fight in her," he sneered. He dropped his empty pistol and lunged, not at Eli, but at Clara. He was fast. Before she could react, he had his hands on her, trying to wrestle the rifle away, to use her as a shield. She fought back, kicking and struggling, but he was too strong. His fingers closed around her throat, squeezing. Her vision started to go dark at the edges. Then she remembered the knife Eli had given her, tucked into her belt. With her last bit of strength, she fumbled for it, pulled it free and plunged it into Jenkins' side. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough. Clara twisted away, gasping for air. Jenkins staggered back, his hand pressed to his bleeding side, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Clara, no longer with contempt, but with something like fear. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. He took one more step, then his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the cave floor. And then he was still. Silence descended once more, broken only by Clara's ragged breaths. It was over. They found the back way out, the passage Mariah had known of, and emerged into the blinding white of a world reborn. The storm had passed. The sun was shining on the fresh, pristine snow. It was quiet, peaceful. They were alive. They never went back for the silver. They sealed the rear entrance to the cave, leaving the singing stone and the bodies of Jenkins and his men to the mountain. The claim was legally Clara's, but she knew the silver was a curse. They had what they needed, their freedom and each other. Months later, word trickled up from Pine Crossing. With Jenkins and his men vanished, the railroad's push into the high country stalled. Boyd, having drunk and gambled away all of Eli's gold, was run out of town for being a deadbeat and a fool. The fraudulent marshal was exposed and recalled. The town and the valley were safe. Clara never went back to Pine Crossing. Her home was the small cabin on the mountain. She learned the ways of the wilderness from Eli and the wisdom of the world from Mariah. She grew strong, not just in body, but in spirit. The girl who was once sold because she was told she was worthless had found her true value. It wasn't in her size or her appearance. It was in her courage, her resilience, and her heart. She, Eli, and Mariah had formed a new family, one forged in fire and ice, bound by loyalty and respect. They were the keepers of the mountain, its silent, watchful guardians. The story of what happened up there became a local legend, a ghost story told around campfires. They say if you listen closely on a cold winter night, you can still hear the mountain singing. It's a song of justice, a song of survival, and a song of a young woman who found her voice in the heart of the storm. If you enjoyed this story and you believe in the power of courage to overcome cruelty, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because every story like this is a reminder that even in the darkest wilderness, the strongest spirits can find their way home. Thanks for listening.